Amara Lewis felt the weight of 100 eyes as she crossed the polished oak stage of Yale's Sterling Law Auditorium. The murmurs came first, soft, jagged comments that tumbled between the pristine white walls and mahogany benches like loose pebbles on glass. Then came the laughter, not the kind that filled a room with warmth, but that cold, clipped chuckle of a room convinced it already knew the ending of the story. The laugh that says, "What is she doing here?" She'd heard it before. In classrooms where her questions were met with raised eyebrows, in bookstores where employees followed her like a shadow, in debate clubs where her Harlem accent was mocked as street slang. But here, at the Yale National Invitational Debate Tournament, it landed differently. It cut sharper, because here, Amara wasn't just a girl from uptown. She was the anomaly in a room calibrated for legacy, privilege, and unspoken expectations. Her name had barely been announced before the smirk surfaced. A girl in a cream blazer from a prep school in Connecticut leaned over to her teammate and whispered something that made both of them grin. A senior from Princeton Prep audibly scoffed as Amara adjusted the mic stand to her height. The front rows, filled with sponsors, retired deans, and alumni who built endowments with old money, watched with the detached curiosity reserved for unpredictable sideshows. But Amara stood steady. She inhaled deeply, the air tasting of lacquered wood and dust filtered through old privilege. Her pulse drummed a steady beat against her ribcage as she glanced at the folded paper on the podium, the topic drawn for the final round. Meritocracy and social mobility in America, myth or model. A smile curled at the corner of her lips. How poetic. How perfect. Because Amara Lewis was not supposed to be on that stage. The selection committee had made that clear in subtle ways. The missing email confirmations, the rescheduled qualifying rounds, the absent invitations to the pre-event mixers. They hadn't counted on her making it through local tournaments in Harlem, let alone through the Northeastern regional eliminations. She was, in every way, an uninvited guest at a dinner where every seat was already assigned. Her fingers grazed the edge of the podium. It was smooth, cool to the touch. In the hush before she spoke, she remembered what her grandmother, Lorraine Lewis, used to say. Some rooms you don't walk into to ask for space. You walk in to take it. Amara lifted her gaze, meeting the eyes of a middle-aged judge with a Yale class ring and a smirk that hadn't faded since she stepped on stage. In that moment, she felt the room hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in quiet expectation of her failure. Good. She thrived in those moments. With a steady hand, Amara adjusted the microphone closer to her mouth, her voice carrying the calm defiance of a girl who had learned to measure words like weapons. The opening line left her lips, clean and unshaken. Before I argue for or against this resolution, let's be honest about who usually gets to answer this question, and who gets left out of the conversation entirely. There it was, the first real silence of the night. A few rows back, a Yale student journalist lowered his phone mid-record. A judge shifted in her seat. The laughter didn't return. Amara let it hang there, a pause thick enough to be intentional, before continuing. She wasn't rushing. The words weren't pre-written on index cards like the other competitors. They were etched onto her bones from years of living the answer to a question most people at Yale debated like an abstract idea. As she laid the foundation of her argument, citing studies from Princeton's sociology department, data from the Brookings Institution, and personal testimony from her community in Harlem, the tension in the auditorium shifted. It wasn't that she spoke louder than the others. She spoke clearer, cleaner. Each word deliberate, razor-edged, designed not just to inform but to indict. Behind the smug smirks and dry humor of the room was a brittle framework of entitlement, and Amara had every intention of shattering it piece by piece. She knew what came next. The patronizing questions, the attempts to corner her on technicalities, the accusations of emotional appeals. She was prepared, because what no one in that room realized yet was that Amara Lewis wasn't there to win a trophy. She was there to change the rules of the room. And in the seconds after her opening statement, as eyes began to narrow and notebooks started to scribble, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice again. Make them remember your name, baby. If this story of injustice and transformation moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that turn pain into power. Long before Amara Lewis ever stepped onto that stage at Yale, before the eyes of old money and smug entitlement locked onto her like a target, there was a one-bedroom apartment on 135th Street, a rusted fire escape that overlooked cracked sidewalks, and a woman named Lorraine Lewis who raised a warrior with nothing but second-hand books and unyielding love. Amara's earliest memories were of the kitchen radio, its battered plastic casing permanently tuned to WBLS, while Lorraine hummed along to Luther and Aretha as she pressed uniforms for the neighbors. Lorraine worked 3 jobs: cleaning offices downtown, caring for an elderly woman named Miss Hattie in the afternoons, and managing a laundromat at night. But every evening without fail, she'd sit Amara at the tiny kitchen table, pull out a battered deck of flashcards and drill her on vocabulary words pulled from the New York Times, articles Lorraine clipped and saved like relics of a world determined to forget them. Baby, she'd say, her voice rough with exhaustion, but her eyes lit with something unbreakable. Words are currency in rooms built to bankrupt you. Amara had never known her mother. Rumors in the neighborhood claimed she'd run off when Amara was 2. Her father was a name no one spoke, but Lorraine was never interested in pity. She taught Amara to debate before she could properly read, turning dinner-table conversations into lessons in logic and evidence. Don't just tell me you're mad the landlord raised the rent, Lorraine would challenge, slicing into overcooked spaghetti with a plastic fork. Tell me why it's unjust, who benefits, who suffers, and what history says about people like us when the system gets tight. By 10, Amara was writing letters to city officials demanding repairs for the playground down the street. By 12, she stood on milk crates at community meetings, arguing for summer programs for kids who had nowhere else to go. She wasn't loud. She was precise. Her voice had weight, like a stone dropped in a still pond, sending ripples where others barely made a splash. It wasn't an easy childhood. Harlem in the early 2000s was a city of contradictions. $1-million brownstones rising alongside housing projects, organic cafes next to corner bodegas. Amara learned early how to read a room, to sense which conversations welcomed her and which ones tolerated her presence like background noise. She knew what it meant to be unseen until someone needed her labor or her pain as a statistic. At Frederick Douglass Academy, she found a mentor in Mr. Elijah Carter, a world history teacher with skin like polished mahogany and a memory sharper than any textbook. He saw something in Amara others overlooked, a mind too quick to be boxed in by rote memorization. Mr. Carter signed her up for the school's debate club against her protests. I don't have time for that, Amara had insisted. I've got shifts at the bodega. I tutor Miss Renee's son after school, and we still owe Con Ed from last winter. But Mr. Carter didn't ask. He told her where to be and when. The first time she spoke at a regional debate meet, it was a disaster. She fumbled statistics, lost her place in the script, and stumbled through rebuttals. The other teams, mostly prep schools with blazers and laminated folders, barely disguised their contempt. Amara went home that night and didn't cry. Instead, she pulled out every book, every article Mr. Carter had ever given her. She stayed up past dawn, cross-referencing arguments, memorizing policy positions, and dissecting logical fallacies like a surgeon. By the next meet, she didn't need notes. By the end of that season, she was undefeated. It wasn't luck, it wasn't talent alone. It was the resilience that came from being told no. So often it sharpened into defiance. She built her vocabulary from library discards and overheard conversations on subway platforms. She studied court transcripts online and annotated them the way other girls might annotate song lyrics. She watched TED Talks on public speaking in the hours most of her classmates spent scrolling TikTok. Harlem raised her, yes. But it was Lorraine Lewis's relentless insistence that no one owns your voice but you that forged her into the girl who, at 17, would stare down Yale's smug indifference without blinking. That night before the Yale finals, in a dorm room rented by an alum sympathetic to her cause, Amara's phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Carter. "No mercy, kid. Remember who you're carrying with you in that room." She did. As the laughter echoed around her in that auditorium, Amara wasn't standing alone. She had generations at her back. Every woman dismissed in a boardroom. Every kid laughed out of an honors class. Every black voice silenced in spaces built to favor whiteness in blazers and legacy surnames. And for them, she would not fold. The invitation to the Yale National Invitational Debate Tournament had arrived by accident, or at least, that's what they told her. 2 weeks before the qualifiers, Amara Lewis sat on the worn leather couch in the cramped guidance office at Frederick Douglass Academy, the air thick with the sharp scent of old carpet and cheap air freshener. Ms. Grant, the school's counselor, held the official letterhead in trembling hands. "This wasn't meant for us," she whispered, her voice brittle with disbelief. "Yale they don't invite schools from our district." But there it was. Amara's name, typed in black serif font beneath the tournament logo, inviting her to compete in the Northeast Regional qualifiers. A mistake, the tournament organizers would claim days later, when Ms. Grant called to confirm her spot. The email system had glitched. A clerical error. The slot was meant for a student from Dalton or Andover, or maybe Phillips Exeter. Not Frederick Douglass Academy, not Amara Lewis. She remembered the woman's voice on the other end of the line. Polite, clipped, tinged with an assumption of deference. "I'm so sorry for the confusion, Ms. Grant, but unfortunately, those seats have already been allocated." It might have ended there, but Lorraine Lewis didn't raise her granddaughter to ask permission. Amara filed an official appeal that afternoon, citing the tournament's public charter on educational access and inclusion. She had the clause memorized within minutes, with the help of Mr. Carter and a sympathetic alum working in Yale's diversity office, an exhausted black woman named Dominique Parker. Amara's case gained traction. 2 local news outlets picked up the story. Local Teen Challenge's Ivy League debate tournament after rejection. By the following week, under pressure to avoid bad press, the Yale Debate Council begrudgingly reinstated her spot. But the message was clear. At the regional qualifiers in Hartford, Amara was greeted with passive-aggressive smiles. The panel chair, a balding man in a navy blazer, deliberately omitted her name from the welcome address. During matches, opponents made snide comments about her accent, her aggressive tone, and the fact she didn't use digital cue cards like the others. A boy from St. Mark's Prep leaned in after one round and muttered, "Must be nice when you get points for diversity." Amara logged every insult, not in a notebook, in her bones. She advanced through the rounds with ruthless efficiency. No wasted words, no pandering to decorum. She dissected policy proposals, challenged historical inaccuracies, and countered emotional appeals with data so sharp it left seasoned debaters scrambling for relevance. By the final round of qualifiers, when the Yale selection committee assembled to announce who would advance to the invitational, the room was thick with expectation. 5 names were read, 4 expected, 1 not. Amara Lewis, Frederick Douglass Academy. A ripple of disbelief passed through the hall. She didn't smile, didn't clap for herself. She packed her bag in silence, aware of the stares, the whispers, the quiet resentment curdling in the corners of the room. Later, she learned through Dominique that certain committee members had tried to strike her from the list. One had argued she didn't fit the profile of a Yale finalist. Another questioned whether her advancement would dilute the prestige of the event. In the end, it wasn't merit that secured her seat. It was pressure. The potential PR nightmare of excluding the only black girl in the top bracket after her public appeal. They let her in to avoid scandal, not because they wanted her there, but Amara didn't care. "A seat's a seat," Lorraine had always told her. "You get 1 foot in, you carve out space for the rest of you." You stay so long they gotta name the chair after you. And so, on the night of the Yale Invitational, Amara walked into Sterling Law Auditorium alone, carrying a borrowed leather folio and a head held high, knowing full well that every glance, every whispered name, every tight-lipped smile was loaded with expectation of her failure. She could feel it pressing against her skin like static in the air. The assumption that she was a diversity pick, a courtesy admission, a symbol rather than a contender. Good. Let them underestimate her. Amara wasn't here for their approval. She was here to burn the blueprint of every closed-door conversation that decided who belonged and who didn't. She took her seat at the front table beside students with legacy surnames, future senators, and hedge fund heirs. They avoided eye contact. She didn't mind. Her grandmother used to say, "People only look you in the eye when they think you're worth fearing or worth following. They ain't ready for either." And by the time she left that stage, they'd be ready for both. The moments before a debate are quiet in a way that hums beneath your skin. For Amara Lewis, those final minutes in the green room felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. The air was thick with hushed conversations, the rustle of note cards and the muted ping of message notifications. Students clustered in careful formations, the Dalton boys in navy blazers, the Choate girls in pearls, Andover kids tapping away on MacBooks. No one spoke to her. She wasn't surprised. Amara had long since learned there's a silence some people wrap around you like a noose made of velvet. Not overt exclusion, no one shouted slurs or barred her from the room, but a subtle kind of erasure. The way glances slid past her, how conversation started when she walked away. The way one Yale senior leaned against a wall and, without breaking eye contact, let a slow, mocking smile creep across his face as she adjusted her debate badge. It wasn't that they didn't see her. It was that they did, and decided she didn't matter. Amara sat alone at the far corner, rereading her notes by the dim glow of a flickering wall sconce. She didn't need them. The words were memorized, stitched into the fabric of her lungs, but it was easier than looking up at the room's curated indifference. She knew what they thought of her. The unspoken assumptions hung heavy in the air like smog. She's aggressive, too emotional, probably got a special scholarship, didn't really earn this. It wasn't new. She'd heard it when applying for internships, when speaking at community boards, when daring to answer too confidently in advanced placement U.S. history. And here, at Yale, it was more polished, dressed up in prep school diction and faux sympathetic smiles. Across the room, her final round opponent, Reed Whitman, a third-generation Yale legacy with a debating resume longer than most legal textbooks, was holding court with a group of students and judges, casually referencing his grandfather's endowment to the university. His words, like his privilege, flowed effortlessly. Amara knew she could out-argue him. She'd watched his rounds online. All style, little substance. He memorized statistics without context, recited quotes without lived experience. But he wore the uniform of the accepted, pale skin, blue blazer, an ease born of certainty that no room would ever reject him. When their eyes met across the room, Reed lifted his chin in a gesture that wasn't quite a nod, more a warning, an assurance that this round was a formality. Amara smiled back, a small, deliberate curve of her lips that made Reed's smugness falter for a fraction of a second. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need their applause, but she felt the weight of invisible chains all the same, the generational trauma, the narrowed opportunities, the assumption that every achievement was an exception rather than a birthright. She carried it all, not as a burden but as armor. Her phone buzzed, a text from Lorraine. "They can't erase what's written in fire, baby. Go be fire." Amara exhaled, closed her notebook, stood. She walked past students who averted their gaze, past a judge who stared a beat too long, past the carefully arranged comfort of a world designed to exclude her. As she neared the stage entrance, a Yale sophomore handed her a debate program. "Good luck," she muttered, though her eyes betrayed the expectation of defeat. Amara took the program, nodded, and stepped through the curtain. The auditorium lights hit her like a sudden sunrise, sharp and blinding. 100 faces, 100 judgments waiting to be made. The laughter came, soft and scattered. Not cruel, just casual, dismissive, as though her presence was the setup to a joke they already knew the punchline to. And in that instant, as the weight of every invisible chain pressed against her chest, Amara felt something break loose inside. Not fear, not anger, clarity. Because there's a quiet kind of revolution in walking into a room built to see you fail and daring to win anyway. And as she reached the podium, placed her hands against the cool wood, and locked eyes with the front row of smirking faces, she remembered what Lorraine had always said. Some chains you break by force, others you make them wear while you build your own throne. Amara adjusted the mic, smiled, let them laugh. The air inside Sterling Law Auditorium felt dense, like it carried weight, centuries of inherited expectation compressed into an evening spectacle. Every face in the audience reflected a different species of curiosity, polite interest, silent dismissal, some with open disdain. But none of them expected what came next. The moderator, a lean white man with the weary expression of someone too long in rooms like this, stepped to the center with a slender envelope. This year's final resolution, he announced, will be argued for and against by our distinguished finalists. His tone was practiced, reverent. The topic is meritocracy and social mobility in America, myth or model. A beat of silence, and then, barely perceptible, a shift in the room. The kind of tightening you feel when a question's too close to the bone. A few murmured comments. Some of the students in pressed suits chuckled behind their hands. Reed Whitman smirked. Amara barely moved. She could feel the moment settle over her like a tailored coat. Of all possible topics, immigration, healthcare, climate policy, it would be this. They thought they were lucky. She knew it was war. Because there's a kind of conversation the privileged always have about meritocracy. They like to debate it like an abstract principle, a theoretical mechanism that rewards the deserving without ever asking who gets to write the rules of deserving. They'd quote Adam Smith, reference the American dream, maybe toss in some sanitized historical anecdotes about up-by-the-bootstraps success stories they'd seen on the cover of Time. But for Amara Lewis, meritocracy wasn't theory. It was Tuesday afternoon, watching her grandmother balance 3 jobs and still come home to drill her on Supreme Court precedents. It was the honor roll student at her school who stocked shelves at the corner bodega overnight, because financial aid didn't cover textbooks. It was her own name on a debate bracket they tried to erase. And now, they'd handed her a live wire. The moderator gestured toward Reed. By draw, Mr. Whitman will take the affirmative. Ms. Lewis, the negative. He looked delighted. Reed strutted to the podium, giving Amara a sideways glance laced with condescension so thick you could bottle it. He spoke with effortless confidence, weaving together a tapestry of economic data and textbook definitions. He cited upward mobility statistics from the 1980s, selectively quoted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and told a story about his grandfather emigrating from Ireland with nothing but a coat and a promise. The room nodded along. It was polished. It was comfortable. It was a lie. Amara didn't take notes. She didn't need to. The script was always the same. When her turn came, she didn't walk. She claimed the stage. The mic was too low. She adjusted it without asking. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles steady. And when she spoke, her voice didn't waver. Before I begin, Amara started, her gaze locking with the front row of stone-faced alumni, I'd like to thank my opponent for reminding us of the meritocratic myths that decorate our history books, but don't survive a single honest conversation in a room like this. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the audience. She didn't pause. I stand here as someone this very institution tried not to invite. And if we are to have an honest debate about social mobility in America, let's start with the room we're in. Because for centuries these rooms have remained closed, and when they open, it's rarely because the locks were broken. It's because someone on the inside chose for a moment to hold the door. Her words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. She spoke of facts, not cherry-picked data, but hard truths. She cited longitudinal studies from the Economic Policy Institute, disproving the notion of generational wealth mobility in communities of color. She referenced Yale's own 2018 admissions scandal, where donors' children slid through back doors while valedictorians from Newark and Compton were labeled diversity quotas. Amara told the story of her friend Malik, a kid from their building who turned down a scholarship because he couldn't afford the flight to the interview. She spoke of Lorraine Lewis scrubbing hospital floors, earning less than minimum wage under the table, because official jobs required a college degree she'd never been allowed to earn. She spoke as though the bones of the room itself needed reminding. And then, she turned their language against them. Quoting case law and classic rhetoric, she deconstructed the fallacies of Reed's argument one by one. His carefully chosen statistics, outdated and contextless. His grandfather's immigrant tale, a valuable story, but one impossible for black and brown families under redlining laws and voter suppression acts designed to halt mobility at the door. The meritocracy you defend, Amara said evenly, was not built as a ladder. It was built as a ceiling. And if you're sitting comfortably beneath it, you're not proof of the system's fairness. You're proof of its precision. The auditorium was silent. Even Reed's smug grin had vanished. Amara's final words dropped into that hush like a stone into still water. Meritocracy in America is not a myth because it never existed. It's a myth because it did, for some, and it was sold as a universal truth. Tonight, we leave that lie here, on this stage. No one laughed this time. For a full second after Amara Lewis stepped back from the podium, the auditorium hung in perfect brittle silence. It wasn't the polite pause after a well-delivered speech, nor the shocked quiet that follows an accidental profanity. It was the stillness of a room realizing it had just witnessed something it had no script for. And then the interruptions began. A judge, one of the older men with a Yale lapel pin and a face that had smiled politely through decades of status quo, cleared his throat. "Miss Lewis," he began, his voice laced with condescension camouflaged as civility, "while your passion is admirable, I'd caution against conflating personal anecdotes with structural critique. This is a policy debate, not a memoir." Another judge, a younger woman in designer glasses and neutral lipstick, jumped in. "And let's be mindful to adhere strictly to the parameters of academic discourse, Ms. Lewis. Emotional appeals, while compelling, aren't substitutes for evidence-based argumentation." It was a maneuver Amara recognized well, the same tactic used in classrooms, courtrooms, and corporate board meetings. Discredit by category. Call it emotional, anecdotal, unprofessional. Frame truth as out of bounds because it makes power squirm. Across the stage, Reed Whitman smirked, recovering his composure like a man who believed the machine would reset to its default. He adjusted his tie, ready to deliver a rebuttal crafted not to dismantle her argument, but to restore the order she'd disturbed. Amara inhaled. She wasn't new to this. From the time she was 8, correcting a math teacher who miscounted black inventors during Black History Month, to every debate round where she was docked for being too assertive, Amara had learned how institutions respond to voices like hers. Not with outright bans. They were far too polite for that. They wielded erasure through protocol, through what was considered acceptable discourse, through which truths got categorized as improper tone. So when the moderator gestured for Reed's rebuttal, and the boy began in a tone of faux graciousness, "I commend my opponent's personal story, though I must remind the audience that meritocracy, by definition, transcends individual circumstance." Amara didn't flinch. She waited. Listened as Reed cherry-picked half-truths and misquoted sources she knew better than he did. He referenced a Brookings statistic without its devastating qualifier, that upward mobility for Black Americans stagnates after one generation. He recited passages from the Federalist Papers, ignoring the author's intent to preserve power among landed white male elites. The audience, hungry for restoration, nodded along. Some relieved, others skeptical but unwilling to challenge a narrative that asked less of them. When her rebuttal turn came, Amara didn't raise her voice. She lowered it. "The only thing more dangerous than a flawed system," she said, steady and clean, "is one defended by people too comfortable to notice its damage." She calmly pointed out Reed's selective data. She read the rest of the Brookings line aloud, letting the weight of its omission expose him. She recited a section from the Federalist Papers herself, one where the founders explicitly named their distrust of universal enfranchisement. And then she looked directly at the older judge, who'd cautioned her about anecdotes. "Since you consider lived experience outside the bounds of academic debate," she said, her tone silk-covered steel, "I'll remind you that every law this nation has passed was, in fact, a response to human suffering. The 14th Amendment was not a data point. It was a demand born from blood and bondage. So when I speak of those impacted by systemic inequity, I am engaging in the oldest form of policy argumentation there is, testifying to harm." A hush fell again, but it felt different this time, heavier. From the side of the stage, Amara noticed Dominique Parker, the exhausted diversity office alum who had fought to keep her in the tournament, sitting near the back. Tears shimmered at the corners of Dominique's eyes, but she smiled. A tight, proud thing meant for no one but Amara. Reed attempted one final rebuttal, his rhythm faltering as he scrambled to reassert control. He defaulted to abstractions, the integrity of systems, the necessity of aspirational frameworks. The words felt hollow now. They fell into the space Amara's voice had made too real. When time was called, and both debaters were asked to make final statements, Amara left them with a single, unhurried line. "The most dangerous thing about myths isn't that they aren't true. It's how much damage people will do to protect them." She stepped back, and no one laughed this time. The auditorium stayed still. The old judge averted his gaze. Reed stared at the floor. The moderator fumbled through his closing remarks, his voice suddenly absent its earlier smugness. In rooms like these, history rarely turns on a dime. But sometimes a girl like Amara Lewis walks in, shatters the glass fiction, and leaves enough cracks for others to follow. Amara Lewis wasn't supposed to be capable of this, not according to the rules Yale had written long before it ever invited her through its polished doors. The illusion had been curated over centuries, a theater of fairness, where those with money called it merit, and those with power named it earned. That night, Amara tore through it. The final vote wasn't supposed to be close. In the tournament's history, no debater from a public school outside of the Ivy feeder network had ever claimed the national title, and certainly not a 17-year-old black girl from Harlem, who walked into their tradition without asking for permission. But Amara didn't need their odds. In the minutes after the final statements, the judges retreated to deliberate behind closed doors. The audience spilled into the marble-floored foyer, conversations jagged and tense. Words like controversial, unorthodox, too personal floated through the air, though no one said them directly to her face. Amara stayed by herself in a corner, sipping water, her fingers still wrapped around the edge of her debate program. She wasn't afraid. She'd seen this before. How systems cling to decorum like a drowning man to driftwood when someone dares to name what it actually is. Across the room, Reed paced like a man expecting inevitable victory but smelling the faint whiff of risk. He caught Amara's eye once and offered a tight, brittle smile. Not the arrogant smirk from earlier, something smaller, an instinctive twitch in the face of a storm he'd never had to weather. Amara didn't look away. In those 20 minutes of deliberation, something else began to happen. Students from other schools, ones who'd laughed, dismissed her, avoided sitting near her, started murmuring. A girl from Dalton whispered something to her teammate and snuck a glance Amara's way. A boy from Andover pulled out his phone and started replaying clips he'd recorded of her speech. Because even if the judges didn't intend to recognize her, the room couldn't unhear what she'd said. And outside that elite circle, beyond the paneled walls of Yale's old auditorium, it was already spreading. Dominique Parker, the Yale Diversity Office alum, had discreetly live-streamed the debate on a private student group feed. In minutes, it leaked to Twitter. Clips of Amara's rebuttal raced across timelines under hashtags like "Taun Meritocracy," "Is a Myth," and "Harlem Takes Yale." Students in dorm rooms from Howard to Columbia were already watching. Alumni chimed in. Even a few faculty members, emboldened by the social media storm, started quietly liking and retweeting. By the time the debate committee emerged with their verdict, the illusion wasn't just cracked, it was hemorrhaging. The moderator cleared his throat, the tremor barely concealed. In what was undoubtedly one of the most impassioned and unique final rounds in tournament history, he began, "The judges have reached a decision." Amara felt nothing, no nerves, no hope. Just a steady quiet, a knowing. The winner of the 64th Annual Yale National Invitational Debate Tournament is... A pause so long it bordered on the theatrical. Amara Lewis, Frederick Douglass Academy. At first, there was no applause. Just a moment of stunned, breath-held silence and then a single clap from Dominique, then another. And then a ripple through the back rows, as students who'd only hours before seen her as a novelty now realized they were witnessing something bigger than points and trophies. Reed Whitman's face didn't crumble. It stayed frozen in a practiced expression of gracious defeat. But his eyes betrayed the flicker of disbelief that someone like Amara could exist, let alone win. Amara stood, accepted the trophy with a grip as steady as her voice had been, and walked to the mic one final time. "I didn't come here tonight for a title," she said. "I came to remind this room, and every room like it, that merit isn't something you own. It isn't a birthright, and it sure as hell isn't yours to gatekeep." She placed the trophy on the edge of the podium. "I don't need it," she said, her voice carrying through the stone-walled chamber. "But you'll remember my name anyway." And then she walked off stage, leaving the institution to reckon with the jagged space she'd carved into their immaculate tradition. Outside, her phone buzzed with hundreds of notifications, journalists already calling, alumni offering apologies, students DMing thank yous. One message from a student at a public school in Detroit read, "I didn't know we could win those. Thank you." That was the real victory. Amara Lewis hadn't just won a debate. She shattered the illusion that rooms like Yale's could decide who mattered. There are silences you earn and silences you steal. That night at Yale, Amara Lewis left behind a silence that neither applause nor polite conversation could cover. It settled into the floorboards, crept up the wood-paneled walls, and perched on the shoulders of men and women so used to controlling the narrative that they didn't realize the story had slipped from their hands. As Amara exited the stage, the weight of her presence lingered like a storm cloud refusing to clear. Reed Whitman didn't chase after her. The judges didn't meet each other's eyes, and the audience, primed for the usual congratulatory handshakes and champagne toasts, hung awkwardly in clusters of fractured conversation. It wasn't just that she'd won, it was how. Because even the most insulated institutions survive by illusions, the illusion that power equals wisdom, that tradition equals merit, that those who ascend do so by virtue of their talent alone, not because the game was written in their favor. And Amara, with her calm precision and unsentimental truths, had burned that illusion alive. The post-debate reception moved to a chandelier-lit banquet hall. The air smelled of old money and fresh-cut orchids, but the conversations had changed. They were no longer about who'd secured internships, which senator's kid was dating which judge's nephew, or where to vacation on spring break. Now it was, "Did you see that girl from Harlem? Where did she learn to debate like that? Was the final fair? Should personal experience count as evidence?" Some of them tried to frame it as a fluke, a controversy, an aberration. But others, young debaters, a few faculty, even an older judge known for his rigid adherence to decorum, sat in small huddles rewatching clips of Amara's speech on their phones. Words that had been spoken an hour before were now headlines online. The most dangerous thing about myths is how much damage people do to protect them. Amara Lewis shakes Yale to its core. Dominique Parker found Amara in a quiet courtyard behind the hall, sitting on a low stone bench beneath a canopy of ivy. The cold night air brushed at the edges of Amara's blazer, but she didn't shiver. Her phone lit up every few seconds with new notifications, her name ricocheting through feeds and group chats. "You know what you just did, right?" Dominique asked, lowering herself onto the bench beside her. Amara exhaled, the fog of her breath mingling with the dark. "I didn't ask to start a war," Dominique smiled. "Yeah, well, revolutions rarely ask permission." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of voices behind them, a world recalibrating in real time. "I watched them during your speech," Dominique said quietly. "They tried so hard not to react. The old ones, the legacy kids, even the faculty. But you could see it in their faces. You changed something they can't unhear." Amara stared up at the ancient stone building, at the windows that had seen generations of debates, generations of exclusions, of backroom deals and secret legacies. "They'll find a way to patch it up," she said, voice low. "They always do." "Maybe," Dominique admitted, "but it won't be as clean this time." Amara knew what that meant. The system might survive, but it would limp now, its myths exposed, its rituals tainted. And for every student watching from Harlem, Detroit, Oakland, or Newark, a new map had just been drawn. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was a crack, and cracks spread. Dominique handed her a printed email, one forwarded from a professor of linguistics at Howard University, offering Amara a summer fellowship, another from Columbia's law department, inviting her to speak at their equity forum. And then, the last one, a scholarship offer from Yale itself. Full ride. Amara let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "They didn't even want me in this tournament. Now they can't have the tournament without you," Dominique said. From behind the ivy wall, the Yale debate chair emerged, his face pinched and pale. He hesitated as if unsure how to approach. "Miss Lewis," he began stiffly, "I wanted to say congratulations. A remarkable performance, truly." It wasn't apology. It wasn't praise. It was the uneasy diplomacy of a man who understood too late that the rules of his world had shifted a little without his consent. Amara rose from the bench, her eyes level with his. "Thank you," she said simply. No malice, no mockery, just clarity. Because some victories don't require gloating. The silence that followed spoke louder than any acceptance speech. She and Dominique left together through the courtyard's side gate, where no cameras followed. Amara's phone buzzed with one last message for the night, from Lorraine. "You broke the room, baby. Now build your own." And so she would. By morning, the news had outpaced the institution. The Yale Debate Invitational, once a guarded rite of passage for the well-connected, now bore a different name in social feeds and news tickers. The night Amara, Lewis changed the room. It was never meant to happen like this. The tournament's judges had hoped to control the narrative, to issue their decision, collect polite applause, and preserve the integrity of an old, clean tradition. But tradition had cracked wide open the night before, and now its architects were scrambling to cover the damage. In the small hours after the debate, a closed-door meeting of the debate council convened in a private chamber, their faces drawn, the old stone walls heavy with the weight of a lost century. The verdict had already been delivered, but the aftermath was far from settled. The chairman of the debate council, Richard Summers, a Yale alumnus from a family of Yale men stretching back to the late 1800s, glared down at the official reports. "We have to issue a statement. The language needs to be careful, acknowledging her win without implying any flaw in our process." "She exposed the flaw," one of the younger judges muttered, "and everybody saw it." A tense silence. In another corner of the campus, Dominique Parker was already coordinating with a growing list of student groups: the Yale Black Students Alliance, the Women of Color Pre-Law Collective, the first-year debate team. One by one, they drafted petitions, public letters, and formal demands for greater transparency in judging criteria, for acknowledgement of historic bias in tournament structures, for review of Yale's admissions practices in light of recent public exposure. Because Amara hadn't just defeated Reed Whitman, she had shattered the carefully managed illusion of fairness that events like this were built upon. By midday, the Yale administration released a terse, lawyer-drafted press statement congratulating all participants and commending the event's spirit of intellectual rigor. It deliberately avoided naming her. That didn't matter. Social media had already chosen its headline. National outlets picked up the story: The Washington Post, The Atlantic, NPR. CNN ran a 5-minute segment titled, "Harlem Teens Debate Speech Sparks Ivy Reckoning." A CNN anchor, voice tinged with awe, quoted Amara's line: "Meritocracy in America was not built as a ladder. It was built as a ceiling." In schools across the country, debate coaches cued the video for their students. It wasn't just a victory, it was a rupture. By evening, Reed Whitman's carefully curated public image lay in shambles. Clips of his smug interruptions, his selective data, his condescension flooded Twitter. Anonymous student accounts surfaced screenshots of Whitman family donations to the university's endowment fund, a gesture long understood to secure admissions and placements. His father, a Yale trustee, quietly tendered his resignation before sundown. The Yale Debate Council, in a desperate bid to salvage legitimacy, held an emergency session and voted to formally offer Amara the tournament's keynote speaker spot for the next year. An unprecedented honor. The offer came via email. Amara didn't open it. She was sitting in her grandmother's living room in Harlem, curled up on the couch in a pair of sweats, watching her own speech replay on TV, barely able to believe her own voice had pierced a room she'd spent years being told she didn't belong in. Lorraine Lewis sat beside her, hand resting gently on Amara's shoulder. "You shook their world, baby," Lorraine said softly, pride glinting in her eyes like polished glass. "I wasn't even supposed to be there," Amara murmured. "And that," Lorraine said, "is exactly why you had to be." The reckoning didn't stop at Yale. Other Ivy debate tournaments began issuing public commitments to overhaul their judging panels. Public schools demanded inclusion in invitationals historically reserved for private prep academies. Alum donors publicly questioned whether the tradition they'd funded was worth preserving. But it wasn't just debate rooms. Across law schools, policy panels, and business summits, a conversation sparked by a 17-year-old girl refusing to play by their rules began to spread. In one Manhattan boardroom, a venture capital firm sent a mass email reminding partners of their diversity initiatives, a thinly veiled panic response to the public firestorm. In a Detroit high school, a teacher printed out Amara's final statement and taped it to the front of his classroom. And somewhere in a small-town diner in Georgia, a young black girl watched the video on a cracked iPhone and whispered to herself, "If she did it, maybe I can too." A crack had split through centuries of polished veneer, and the world, whether it liked it or not, would not look the same again. A week after the debate, the trophy arrived at Amara's apartment in a cardboard box. No ceremony, no press photo. Just a generic letter from the Yale Debate Council, folded into the packing slip. It was a trophy like any other, polished metal, engraved plaque, a symbol of accomplishment. Amara placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. It felt too small for what had happened. By then, the world outside her Harlem apartment had moved into a different orbit. Requests for interviews poured in. The New York Times, The Daily Show, Teen Vogue. Celebrities tweeted her words. College professors quoted her speech in lectures about the politics of power and language. And everywhere she went, from the corner bodega to the community center where she used to tutor Malik's little brother, People spoke her name like a promise. Amara Lewis had become a symbol, but symbols are dangerous things in the wrong hands. They get polished, made safe, reshaped into versions that institutions can swallow. Yale's public relations office invited her to visit campus as a guest of honor for a diversity summit. An Ivy League think tank offered her a fellowship, dangling stipends and connections. Dominique Parker pulled her aside one evening, over greasy takeout containers and weary smiles. "Be careful, kid," she said, peeling open a fortune cookie without reading the paper inside. "They'll try to own your story now. Soften it, package it, make it theirs." Amara understood. She'd felt it in the polite, distant tones of administrators suddenly eager to schedule meetings, in the emails full of backhanded praise. "Your speech was so moving, a valuable perspective to add to our conversation." As if she'd volunteered to be a footnote in their carefully managed narrative. But Amara wasn't interested in being a cautionary tale or a mascot for Ivy reform. She was building something else. In the months that followed, she turned down offers designed to co-opt her voice. Instead, she launched an independent debate program for public high schools across New York, an initiative Lorraine helped name Firekeepers. The mission wasn't just to teach argumentation, but to arm young people with the tools to challenge the rooms built to exclude them. Within a year, Firekeepers had trained over 200 students, sending dozens to tournaments that had never seen a single black or brown competitor from a public school. They didn't always win. That wasn't the point. The point was to take space, and cracks kept spreading. At Yale, Dominique quietly oversaw a review of the tournament's judging criteria. Several old guard members resigned. A student-led petition demanded an inquiry into legacy admissions. A year after Amara's debate, the university announced the elimination of its donor preference policy. It was framed as a modernization initiative, but those who knew the fight knew whose voice had started it. Amara turned 18 with little fanfare. No lavish parties, no TV specials, just a small gathering at Lorraine's apartment. Malik's family, Mr. Carter, a handful of students from Firekeepers, and Dominique. They ate too much peach cobbler, told loud, unruly stories, and passed around the trophy like it was a relic from an old world none of them planned to honor. Later that night, Amara sat alone on the fire escape, looking out over the city. It wasn't perfect. The work ahead was endless. Systems don't crumble in a night. But something had shifted, not because she'd been louder than the room, but because she'd named the lie so cleanly no one could pretend not to hear it. The next morning, Amara received a letter from the principal of Frederick Douglass Academy. A new debate room was being built, funded by anonymous donations. The plaque over the door would read, "The Amara Lewis Forum." She folded the letter, slipped it into a book on her shelf. Not for the recognition, but for every girl coming after. Because she knew now what Lorraine had always told her. Some rooms you walk into to win. Others you walk into so no one else has to fight for a seat again. And for the first time in generations, the door stayed open.